Okay. Good evening, everyone. As the winter is descending upon us, I see I'm wearing a sweater. I'm looking at my wife over there under a blanket. So definitely winter is descending upon us. Um, so uh, we're going to take a look at uh, at the first section of this week's Torah reading, and obviously we've been looking at this section over and over and over again. And there are two different issues that in previous years I've spoken about. And for the first time this year, I'm looking at the two separate issues. And as I'm going to get to in about, I don't know, 40 minutes or so, I think that the two issues are really one. And I never really thought of it that way until our present situation that's going on here in Eretz Yisrael. The first section, first parsha of this week's Torah reading is very Zionistic. And the climax of this Zionistic situation is the verse that I have at the top of the page. And it begins with the word that a lot of commentaries have trouble translating. I've got about, I think, 10 different translations written that I wrote for myself from different sources. It says, Vayakam Sedei Ephron, and the field of Ephron. So Ephron was the ruler, leader of the community in Kiryat Arba, also called Hebron. He and another gentleman named Mamre were apparently the leading lights in that area. So it said the field that he had owned, Yakam. Literally, that means rose up. And we're going to see a lot of rabbis are going to try to translate it as its spiritual level rose. We'll see a lot of that. But I'm looking at the translations I just wrote down from many, many sources. Passed, or that means passed over, passed to, made sure that it was secured by the other person, was deeded over, secured, became the other's, officially transferred title, changed owners, of course, sold, became uncontested property. Now, as the idea of Vayakam has two different connotations. Either, as many of the rabbis are going to say in a few minutes, it rose in spiritual level, passing from this ruler or head of the community of the Gentiles in Hebron to Avram Avinu. And we're going to talk more about that in just a few minutes. So it rose in spiritual or level of Kedusha, holiness, or it just changed ownership. You can either say it in the more prosaic way or in the more spiritual way, and they both work. Okay. But it wasn't what you might think. The field transferred ownership from Ephron to Abraham, which was in an area called Machpelah. So there's a field, then there's something called Machpelah. A Machpelah is apparently the cave that's in the field. Okay. And all of this was Lifnei Mamre, near an area of Hebron, Kiryat Arba, that had been ruled by Mamre. Mamre is where Avraham had stayed before. Mamre is apparently his friend. And that area where Avraham did his circumcision is called Eloneh, the oaks of Mamre. Today, archaeologically, we believe, we're not sure, it's near the entrance to the city of the northern entrance to the city of Hebron. And there is an archaeological site there that there was at one point, some sort of holy site there, which was originally apparently Jewish and then became Christian and eventually became Muslim. And it's got this massive stones that are like the stones from the Kotel or the stones from Marat Machpelah. And it's a very impressive place. So it was somewhere between downtown Hebron and this northern entrance to the city. Okay. So it was the Sadeh, the field, and the Ma'ara, the cave. A lot about that cave, right? Asheba, which was in it. The Kol Ha'etz, not just the land, it was trees which were in the field. Most of the trees in that area today are olive trees. Were they olive trees then? I don't know, because they also have the expression elone, which more like oak trees, but probably there are a lot of olive trees. Asher baseda, which are in the field. Asher bechol gvulo saviv, which was in the entire area around. So Avram got a lot more than just the cave. He got this field of agricultural trees that produce something. I'm going to guess, like most of the trees in the area, olives. Okay. So that becomes the highlight of the story. Now, the famous way to deal with it, which I'm going to sort of give away right now, is in the Rashi, and we're going to see a few variations on it in about 5 minutes. First, I'm going to do the Rashi, and then we're going to talk about another issue a little bit. So Rashi says the field of Ephron was made sure. Yakam means there was a firm change of ownership. It changed hands, new management for this field, which included this cave. It received a rise in importance. So Rashi is going for the midrashic, the more spiritual. It wasn't just a transaction. The field became more important, became holier than it had been before, because it passed from the possession of a commoner, a non-Jew, a non-holy person, even though he was a ruler of some sort, local prince, local duke, something like that, into the possession of Abraham, who we view as a king, kingly. But the real meaning of the verse, and that's from a midrash, and we're going to see more of that midrash down the line, maybe in half an hour. But the real meaning of the verse is the field and the cave that was therein and all the trees became secured, became solid property for Avram as a possession. So even though there is a midrash about the spiritual level of the field and the cave and the trees rising, the real meaning is it's a real estate deal. The Siftei Chachamim, who is a collection of rabbis who lived a couple of generations after Rashi and wrote a commentary on Rashi, says, Vayakam does not usually mean acquisition. There is a case where it does mean an acquisition, a change of ownership, and that's in Vayikra. And it's talking about in the areas of Israel, in walled cities, those kinds of properties in an urban walled area changed hands differently than the farmlands outside the city walls. The house in the walled city shall become established, yakam, to one who bought it, as opposed to fields, which after 50 years have to go back to the original owner. When you buy something in a city, it can be a permanent sale. Okay. The house in the walled city shall be established to one who bought it, where Rashi explains that possession is transferred to the buyer's control, as opposed to fields outside the walls where on Yovel, all the property goes back to the original owners. This is because there the verse mentions the buyer after Yakam. The Yakam, it raised from or to the buyer. This became Avram's through a purchase, thus mentioning the buyer after Yakam. So it's similar but a little bit different, but it really means it changed hands. So what we have more than anything else, we're going to talk about this more in just a few minutes, is a real estate deal where this piece of land becomes Abraham's. This verse, though, follows 10 verses of negotiations. And the negotiations are very, I don't know, like a little weird, a little funny. It's like, looking at the verses, I'm just reading from the English where the verses start. Avram comes and he says, I'm an immigrant and a resident among you. Sell me property for a burial place. That's verse 4. The children of Chet say to Avram, oh, sir, you're a prince. You can bury your person in our cemetery. We'll give you the best plot in our cemetery. And Avram, verse 7, says, I don't want that. If you really want to help me bury my dead, listen to me and speak up for me to Ephron. I have a specific piece of land in mind, and I don't want my beloved Sarah to be buried in your cemetery. I want a brand new Jewish cemetery. Let him sell me the Machpelah cave. Okay, we're going to talk more about the cave in a few minutes. Okay. Then Ephron comes and he replies to Abram and he says, no, my lord, listen to me. I've already given you the field. I don't want, it's yours. It's Ke'ilu, it's as if it's already yours. I've given you the cave and that's it. It's yours. Bury your dead. Avram then says, he spoke to Ephron and he says, just listen to me. Do you notice there's something going on? There's everybody saying, listen to me. I'm giving you money for the field. Ephron says, okay, listen to me. Again, listen to me. He says, how about 400 silver shekel? It was free a minute ago. Now it's 400 silver shekel, which is a lot of money. Some people say that it was 20 pounds of silver. That 400 shekel of silver was 400 pounds of silver. That's a lot of money. Many thousands of dollars today. And then it says, Avram understood what Ephron meant. He weighs out the money, and then comes our verse that says the field becomes his, only after all that negotiation. But I wrote down on the sheet in front of you, if you can see it, in verse 6, the people say to Avram, Shema'enu, listen to us. Then in verse 8, Avram says, Shema'uni, listen to me. Then in verse 11, it's now Ephron says, Shema'eni, listen to me. Then in verse 13, it's back to Avram, Shema'eni, listen to me. And then in verse 15, it's basically back to Ephron, listen to me. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 listen to me's. And no one was listening until verse 16, the verse before ours, when it says, oh, Vayishma, Avram heard. What's going on here? What is, Moshe Rabbeinu in the text of our Chumash trying to teach us? That the discussion between Abraham, the people of the city, and eventually Ephron was different sides who were not listening to each other. Each one was saying, listen to me. But all of this negotiation, the back and forth, can only end when finally Avram, the verse records, listened. He heard what Ephron meant. What did Ephron mean? Give me a lot of money. And so he gave him a lot of money. But it's going back and forth, and no one is really paying attention to the other person. Someone once said, when I made Aliyah years ago, that in Israel, a dialogue is 2 simultaneous monologues because neither side is listening to the other. Everyone's just saying what they want to say, but not hearing what the other person is saying. This is so true of many negotiations. Sadly, it's even true in families where people say things And we don't really hear what they're saying. We just say what's on our mind. We're not trying to really hear. What we want is to be heard. But that could have gone on and on and on forever until finally Avram really hears what it is that Ephron wants, which is a lot of cash. I always thought that this was like a side issue that really didn't have that much to do with the fact that we're describing a transfer of land to a Jew in Eretz Yisrael for the first time. And that's what a lot of the commentaries are going to be talking about in the next few minutes. But don't forget about that, what should I call it? That inability to communicate that was going on in that negotiation. We're going to return to that just before we end this evening. So we brought it up, but we're going to get back to it quite soon. But first, we want to talk about the transfer of land, and I think some very beautiful ideas. The Sforno is not one of the beautiful ideas. He's more technical. The word v'yakam teaches that the purchase was confirmed, and he claims by a sealed document. I don't know where he got that idea. But he claims that this was a real land sale with a deed that was witnessed, and all sorts of, all sorts of seals were put on it and ribbons, and everybody knew. Okay. Hakatava HaKabbalah is less interested in the document, like the Sforno. The Katav Kabbalah, writing in the 1800s, by means of the money, the field became the property, a kinyan, an acquisition of Avraham. The transaction was witnessed and accepted. No, not necessarily was there a deed, like the Sforno says. The big deal was the witnessing of the transfer of the cash from Avraham to Ephron, and everybody knows, oh, now the field belongs to Ephron. So there's two important things. According to this Sforno, the most important thing is a deed. Okay, which is nice. But according to the Ketav Kabbalah, his name was Rabbi Yaakov Mecklenburg. According to Rabbi Mecklenburg, the most important thing is the transfer of the cash in front of witnesses. The people witnessed the cash transaction. Okay. The Lavush, who is much more of a mystical writer, who was, by the way, a contemporary, it's a little bit later than the Sforno, a little bit earlier, in the 16th century. He says the language of kama vayakam, the land rose, as a purchase and acquisition. The unusual sounding word kam here also refers in the sense of Leviticus, which Rashi, or I shouldn't say Rashi, which the Siftei Chachamim describing Rashi talked about, where it describes the legal procedure. I'm sorry. I apologize. I was doing the Radak. I have to go back to Lavush. The Lavush. The language of Kama implies the property arising from the property of a regular citizen to become royal property. Royalty. Okay? So he's, again, giving a spiritual mean. The Radak is more technical. We'll see that. I'll go to there in a minute. The Kama was actually separate from the transaction. Both the Sforno and Rav Mecklenburg said Kama describes the technical transfer, whether it's a contract or it's a witnessed transfer of cash. They saying Kama is the technical transaction, not the Lavush. Lavush is a much more mystical commentary. Feels strongly that the term Kama is a spiritual term, has nothing to do with business, has to do with the spiritual raising of the level, Kedusha, of the land. Okay. The Kama was actually separate from the transaction. It was instead based on the reaction of the witnesses. I like this idea. The reaction of the witnesses. These Gentiles living in Hebron, Kiryat Arba, watching this, they saw and felt something special was happening. They intuited the significance of this moment, which we're going to talk about in a minute. There was something about Avraham that inspired anybody who witnessed the things that he did to be truly moved and changed by watching that happen. That's what it was instead based on the reaction of the witnesses, so that there would never be a conflict over the ownership. But it's like they saw that what this meant to Abraham, and they were moved by it. The Radak again, which I started to read by mistake a minute ago, he is more a technical. Rabbi David Kimchi, he was a student of the Rambam, and he says it's about purchase, acquisition, more technical. The unusual sounding word also occurs, as we saw in Vayikra, as Rashi talked about, where it describes the legal procedure of redeeming property from temple treasurer or in walled cities by paying a premium. The term is chosen to describe a transaction of a permanent, enduring nature, which means everything here is technical. Okay. Now, Fox is Professor Everett Fox, who is not he's a professor of biblical literature. I mean, he's Jewish, but he's not, an orthodox commentary. He's more of a scholarly approach. And he looks at this and he says, oh, this sounds familiar to me from my background in archaeology. The long conversations and considerable formality of the conversation going back and forth, he doesn't feel it was 2 or 3 groups of people not quite understanding what each one's saying. He said it was a formal ritual that he sees in other documents from that period, which are not unusual in an ancient Near Eastern context. The narrative strikes a curious balance between the emotional reality of the situation. I think this is a very, very wise comment of Professor Fox. There's 2 things going on. He feels it. He not a spiritual commentary, more of a technical commentary, but he feels what's going on. There is repetition of the word dead, presence, bury. There's something spiritual, emotional going on, and the requirements of the legal procedure. Hear me, give title, holding, description of the trees and the cave. It's fascinating that he feels, even though it mimics some other ancient texts of a technical nature of land transference, but our text also has some emotional power to what's going on. Okay, again, back to more rabbinic approaches. The Or HaChaim, who's very spiritual, he actually made Aliyah in the 1740s and died in Yerushalayim in 1750. Upon hearing this, he's not talking about our text. He's talking about when the Jews were going to leave Egypt. Upon hearing that the Jews wanted to leave Egypt, he says, Kumu tsu'u, arise and depart. This is after the 10th plague. He says, Kumu, arise. The expression Kumu may hint at Pharaoh's granting the Israelites a higher status. So he's saying that our text is saying the land got a higher status by becoming the property of Abraham, as opposed to the property of Ephron the Hittite. And the Breshit Rabbah, commenting on that same idea, the field of, it's really taking this, but comparing it, the field of Ephron Vayakam, it had been lowly and was now elevated. The field that was in Machpelah, this teaches us that it doubled in value. What's the word Machpelah mean? Kafel means double. So some people say it's because there were couples buried there. Some people say it's because the cave itself was a cave within a cave, a double cave. But he says it's called Machpelah because it doubled in value. It wasn't worth 400 silver shekel until Avram bought it. Now it's worth 400 silver shekel. It doubled in value in the eyes of everyone, and that anyone who is buried in it can be certain that his reward in heaven is machpelah, kaful, doubled. Rabbi Abahu said it is because it's not the word kaful, double, it's really the word kapel, fold, because God folded up the great height of Adam, the first man, and buried him there. This midrash is quoting a famous idea, and if you ever go, and everyone should, I hope everyone does find an opportunity to visit Marat Machpelah. It's one of my favorite places here in Eretz Yisrael. There is in the building, this large building that was built by Herod in the approximately 120 before the Common Era. There is an area where they believe is where Adam and Chava are buried. But Adam was so huge, he wasn't like us. He was a much bigger, perfect human being. He had to be folded up to fit in the cave. This is an interesting idea. I don't know how ancient that idea that Adam was there. There have been people that have gone into the cave, and when they found the cave underneath the building, the last people that sneak in there were in the late 70s, and when they looked at it, they found that it was like a hallway in this cave with 6 indentations, slots, or like kuchim, they called indentations in the wall. So apparently, when the place was really ancient, there was 6 people there, and this idea that Adam was there comes from a later period of Jewish history. The Midrash Rabbah that this is quoting was written in the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era. Okay. Rav Yoel Elitzur, and this is from the Yeshivat Har Etzion website, he says, we see that for the Torah, the purchase of the cave itself is not the main point of the narrative. Interesting. He wants a place to bury his beloved Sarah. So you'd think that's what he's really talking about. But it's not, according to him. According to him, rather, it's the purchase of the field and all the trees anywhere within the confines of that field that is the crux of the matter. Really, he's buying a piece of land. It just so happens that on this piece of land is a cave which was appropriate for burial. Jews were buried in caves during the entire period of Tanakh. Only after the destruction of the Second Temple did Jews start burying people underground here in Eretz Yisrael. And we have some examples of that if you go into the area around Modi'in, and they started burying underground. But that was not the way things were done in the biblical periods when we had the Batei Mikdash. People were buried in caves. But that wasn't the point. The crux of the matter was the field. What this means on a fundamental level is that Parshat Chayei Sarah is less concerned with Sarah's burial and the events surrounding it, and more concerned, side 2, more concerned with the story of the first formal acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael by the first Hebrew or Jew. Abraham has been residing in the land for many years. He comes to Eretz Yisrael when he's 70 years old. We believe that's our normal approach to the story. He buries Sarah when she's 127 years old. And so he was 137 years old at the time. So he's been in Eretz Yisrael for 67 years at this point. He never owned any land until this point. But has not yet been able to acquire land for himself, his family, and his descendants. God had promised him in the Brit Bein B'Tarim, the first major covenant made with the Jewish people. To your offspring, I will assign this land, your children and grandchildren, and for infinite generations are going to own this land. But despite this promise, the great wealth that Avram had amassed, he was very wealthy. He was still essentially a stranger in a strange land. He didn't own any land. Ger v'toshav, I'm a stranger and a resident. I'm a resident alien in this land because I don't own any land, even though I've lived here an entire lifetime. The Canaanites greatly respected Abraham and his new monotheistic religion. But despite that, the people of Canaan would not, under any circumstances, sell Abraham land. You can be our neighbor, but you can't be our partner. You can't own land in Eretz Yisrael. When Sarah dies, Avram decides to take advantage of the opportunity to realize God's promises by making his first real attempt at acquiring land, real estate, from the Canaanites. Avram is announcing that he will not bury Sarah until he has sold a burial site, which is an inheritance. I don't want a kever, I don't want a grave in your graveyard, because that won't belong to us. We will be buried in your land. He says no to that right away. It may be that Avram's request takes the Hittites aback. Maybe they didn't want to send any land. Here's an old man whom they knew as an honorable idealist who was exploiting his personal tragedy in order to acquire property. But Abraham alone knows the truth. This is not just a plot of land. So our verse that we started talking about 40 minutes ago, 35 minutes ago, and says, the land in Machpelah, the field with the cave and all the trees anywhere within the confines of the field, he's not just buying a grave. He's buying inheritable land in the country. It may be a little up, but Abraham alone knows the truth. This is not just a plot of land, but a manifestation of his entire life's purpose. Go forth to the land I will show you is the first instruction God gives to him. To your offspring I will assign this land. But he hasn't got any land yet. Avram finally achieved his goal. He became a legitimate landowner in the promised land. What was going on until now? What did Avram and later Yitzchak and later Yaakov do for a living? They were nomadic shepherds. Nomadic shepherds who spend their winters in Beersheba and their summers in Hebron, moving back and forth. They didn't own any land. They're just in the in the marginal lands around the cities where they can pasture their flocks. He doesn't own any land. So at this point, he finally achieves his goal to become a legitimate landowner in Eretz Yisrael. This is a very significant point in his life. Then and only then was Abraham able to take the final step in cementing his ownership of the land. And then, after owning a field and trees and rocks and whatever else, maybe a stream going through, only after he owns a piece of property, then Avram buries his wife Sarah in the cave of the Machpelah. Skip down on that backside to the next to the last point. It says in Breshit Rabbah, very famous midrash, that it has. It's a very powerful midrash. If it weren't so ironic, it would be very, very powerful. But there's a major sadness to this very famous midrash. Again, Breshit Rabbah, written in the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era, while the Byzantine Empire controlled Eretz Yisrael before the Muslims took over in the 7th century. Reb Yudin Bar Shimon said about our pasuk, this is one of the 3 places, well, really, he says it about the pasuk, really this comes from when Yaakov Avinu buys a piece of land outside Shechem, okay? This is one of the 3 places that the nations of the world cannot deride Israel, cannot make fun of Israel, cannot put the Jews down and say, they are stolen property in your hands. You don't own any of Eretz Yisrael. This is not yours, it's ours. And they can't say that about what? And these are the cave of the Machpelah, which Avraham bought, the temple, which David HaMelech paid the king of the Jebusite king of Yevus, of Jerusalem, money for Har HaBayit. David HaMelech conquered the city. After he conquers the city, he goes over to the king and he says to Aravna, and he says to him, here's money. I want that. I want to own that piece of land with your deed to it. He didn't have to do that, but he didn't want anyone to ever say, Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, isn't ours. Okay? And the 3rd piece of land that was paid for, according to where this comment comes from, is when Yaakov bought for 100 silver coins a little piece of land outside Shechem, and that's where the kever of Yosef Hatzadik is. It's so funny, of course, ironic. I mean, it would be funny if it weren't so sad. Those 3 places are the 3 perhaps most fought over places on planet Earth. The cave in Hebron, the Temple Mount, and Joseph's tomb. Joseph's tomb was the site of terrible violence about 25 years ago, and now people can only visit it with army, with tremendous army support. Jews tend to go there on Rosh Chodesh. There are Jews that go to daven there at Kever Yosef, just outside Shechem on Rosh Chodesh. And then it quotes the verses when Avram bought Mount Machpelah, David HaMelech bought the threshing floor, which becomes the Temple Mount, and Yaakov Avinu bought this little piece of Shechem. It's very powerful, it's very important, but it's very ironic that the fighting for these areas goes on and on and on. The last piece on the page, before we do 2 more pieces that I just want to discuss with you for a couple of minutes, the Torah at the bottom, everyone's field arose. So the Torah, who is Rabbi Yaakov ben Arash, and he wrote the first version of the Shulchan Aruch, and he lived in the 14th century, and again, the son of Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh. The Torah means that the handover of the money was not yet the conclusion of this transaction. The field arose. There was more than just the money. The site had not become a recognized cemetery by Avram, handing over the purchase price. But the Torah means that after it became his property, Avram designated the site as a burial site. So he's agreeing very much with Rabbi Yoel Elitzur that we were talking about a minute ago. What's important isn't the cave. What's important is the field. What's important is Jews now owned, the first Jew now owned land, viable agricultural land in Eretz Yisrael for the first time. And we bought it and paid for it with cash. But the Torah means that after it became his property, Avram designated the site as a burial site and then proceeded to bury his wife there. It was not admissible in those days to convert a piece of earth into a cemetery until such change had been approved by the local community. So in other words, they wanted Avram to not own any land, just bury her in the regular cemetery. First they had to buy the land, and then they okayed On your land, you can bury your family. And of course, that is indeed what happens. Um, Before I make a final point, I'm going to make two sort of side issues that's going to take, just a couple of minutes. The first, I just find interesting. It's the Sfat Emet, which is in the middle of the backside. The Midrash explains that B'nai Chet are mentioned 10 times in the Torah. Okay? Because they helped Avram Pershit Ma'arat HaMachpelah, paralleling the 10 commandments. What's interesting is that I wrote this. The Sfat Emet elaborates that this hints at Bnei Israel, who helped bring Hashem's purchase in the world by constantly testifying that the world and everything in it belongs to Hashem. And then again, I added another sentence. Hasidim look for ways to replace Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim. In other words, the Hasidim, the Sfat Emet was writing this at the end of the 1800s, and most of the Hasidim at that time were not Zionists. They weren't interested in Eretz Yisrael. Many of the Hasidic Rebbeim called their shul something like something Yerushalayim, Beit Yerushalayim, or Chelek Yerushalayim, all sorts of names like that, because they didn't believe that they were going to Eretz Yisrael. They believed that they made Aliyah, if you can call it that, to visit the Rebbe. So the Rebbe was where they went. And so everything, for most of the Hasidim, for most of their history, this wasn't true of some of the early, like Rabbi Nachman, and even, by the way, the Baal Shem Tov talked about coming to Eretz Yisrael. Except for them, it wasn't a big deal, Eretz Yisrael. They were talking about what they would do to replace Eretz Yisrael spiritually in the lives of their Hasidim. And you know, it's sort of sad, and that's why the Sfat Emet, when he's commenting on our verse, isn't talking. He says it's a nice idea, but it's got nothing to do with Eretz Yisrael. It means God owns the entire world. It's about the world. It's not about Eretz Yisrael. And again, the last comment that's on the page before I add my own postscript. Rabbi Yonasan Mishkin, again, this is on the Yeshivat Har Etzion website. In a similar vein, we can cite the notion that anything worth having is worth working for. This is stated in relation to the land of Israel by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who of course lived in Eretz Yisrael, and it was the writer of the Zohar, and is the founder of Kabbalah, and therefore is the father of Hasidus as well, because they claim to be the heirs of the Rashbi. The Holy One, blessed be, gave Israel 3 precious gifts. All of them were given only through suffering, and these are the Torah, the land of Israel, and the world to come. The land is not merely intended, excuse me, as a home for the Jewish people, but as a place used for the service of God. And like the acquisition of Torah knowledge and the reward of the next world, obtaining the land and making it blossom demand a struggle. Chapter 22, therefore, illustrates Avram's effort to secure a part of his homeland as a foreshadowing of his descendants' toil upon entering Eretz Yisrael. That was foreshadowing the beginning of modern Zionism. And that's a totally anti-Hasidic, anti-Haredi way of looking at this entire issue, which I think Pshat is very Zionistic. It's a big deal to buy land in Eretz Yisrael, to own land here, to eventually, after 120 years, to be buried here, or 127 years if we zochet to be like Sarah instead of like Moshe Rabbeinu. That's a real meaning of the section. But here's my question, and something that I don't know why. I don't think I ever noticed it until this year. How come the conversation about getting the land is this back and forth in which no one seems to be listening to the other side until finally, after everybody has said, listen to me, listen to us, listen to me, finally it says, oh, And Avraham actually listened. I think the answer why it's like that, Davka here, it's not just to teach us how, when we negotiate or even talk to people, we should go out of our way to listen to what they have to say. I think the real point is whenever a Jew talks about Eretz Israel, a Goy doesn't listen. When you listen to the news from outside of Eretz Israel, they talk about how the Jews aren't doing a good enough job of taking care of the Gazans in Gaza. The Jews are being very tough on the Lebanese, Hezbollah in Lebanon. They very rarely talk about the fact October 7th, these people acted like animals, destroying and killing and raping and murdering and burning people alive. It's like you don't even hear about that anymore. And oh, isn't it so terrible that Hezbollah is getting wiped out in southern Lebanon? All of that would stop as soon as Hezbollah would stop shooting rockets at Haifa. And all of the Jews, 60 to 70,000 of them, could go home. The fighting would stop in Gaza if Hamas would just give back the hostages and stop trying to kill Jews. It's like the world is upside down because no one wants to hear what the Jews have to say about Eretz Yisrael. That's what's going on at the beginning of this parsha. Everybody is saying, listen to me, and nobody's interested in listening to the other person except at the end, Avraham. The only one who's hearing anything in the present conversations with Hamas, Hezbollah, whoever else in Qatar is involved with the negotiations, and I assume this even includes representatives of the United States and other friendly countries to Israel. They're not hearing what we're saying. They're not hearing our pain. Yes, we will continue to hurt the bad guys as long as they are hurting us. All they have to do is stop, but no one wants to hear that. I was just listening over the weekend to something from, one was from BBC, one was from PBS, and they were talking about people complaining about this and complaining about that and what has to be done. Not one of the people said that the Arabs have to stop killing Jews. That wasn't even brought up. There are many times when I've talked, mostly to Rivka has to put up with me. Many times I'm talking to people and I'm saying, oh, if only we could have better hasbara. If we could just explain our position better, we would be doing so much better.
They don't want to listen.
Marsha, it wouldn't help because they don't want to listen. And since they don't want to listen, they don't hear about our pain. They don't hear about our suffering. The entire world reaction to October 7th lasted about 48 hours. And then all they could talk about is what can we do to save the Gazans? And it's been like that for the last 14 months. It's just so unbelievable. And the comment is, yeah, thank you, Margaret. It's true. It's just so hard. And although we have to continue explaining ourselves, it just doesn't help. And it's like these verses are informing us it's not going to help. because the only one who hears are us. We hear it. We really do hear it. Jews are delivering goods to the Gazans. A lot of it's getting stolen by Hamas. A lot of it's being hijacked. We are listening and delivering. We are announcing in Beirut that we're going to bomb. We're the only ones who hear any of their complaints. No one else. But until someone hears our legitimate complaints of being attacked, of not feeling safe in our own homes, this is just going to go on. And I wish I had a solution. I wish I had a magic wand and taught everybody how to hear what's really going on in the world, but I don't. We have to do the best we can to explain it while simultaneously understanding no one is going to hear our explanations, our pain, our tears, our cries, except for us. And I always thought that the section of the Parsha that talked about listen to me and no one was listening until that was like a lesson about negotiations. And there's a separate issue about Eretz Yisrael. But this year I see for the first time they're the same issue. The issue over which no one can hear us is Eretz Yisrael. And the two concepts of inability to hear what Jew has to say and inability to understand what Eretz Yisrael means to us are the exact same issue. If only the world could learn these 14 verses, and then they might be able to understand the situation in which we find ourselves. Okay. Thank you all very much for being on tonight. Let people know that the recording will be up Be'ezrat Hashem tomorrow, and we just have to keep on doing what we have to do, saying what we have to say, and taking the actions that are hopefully going to save our beloved Medina.
Okay.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.